Good evening. First of all, it is so wonderful to see this room full for this event. It is so wonderful to hear all the laughter and the joy in the room in this particular moment. And I just think that this is the way we should be starting this evening. So first of all, my name is Tina Kampt. I am the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women here at Barnard College. And it is wonderful to welcome you all here on behalf of us all. This is the first of our programming in 2017, and I think it's a really fitting event to start off 2017 with. This year's book salon, and this is our fourth book salon, is actually the third in the series of public conversations that are organized in conjunction with the Practicing Refusal Working Group. The goal of this working group is to create a new exploratory space for Black thought and to theorize different conceptual models for thinking beyond conventional notions of resistance. As our group statement articulates, Practicing Refusal names the urgent desire to rethink the time, space, and fundamental vocabulary of what constitutes politics, activism, and theory, as well as what it means to refuse the terms given to us to name these struggles. We are excited to celebrate the work of one of our members, Christina Sharpe, in conversation with 5 other members of our group. This amazing lineup, as you can tell, takes a lot of work, and I really do need to acknowledge the people who make all of our events possible, and they are our amazing staff, our research assistants who are here, as well as the team that we call Team BCRW, Tammy Navarro, Avi Cummings, Pam Phillips, Hope Dector, and Che Gossett. Please, a round of applause for them. And now, without any more delay, I want to transition to the main event of the evening, the celebration of the extraordinary work that is Christina Sharpe's Black feminist tour de force, In the Wake. There is no more fitting work for us to engage right now on the second day of Black History Month, on the 13th day of the Donald Trump regime of horror, and in the face of a rising tide of opposition and refusal of the daily onslaught of atrocities that we are encountering within this new regime. It is time for us to tarry in the wake. In the Wake has received critical acclaim in numerous reviews and journals, as well as provoking vigorous online and academic discussion in multiple media sites. But I want to begin our engagement with the book by sharing with you an excerpt from a review that Christina has not yet been able to quite partake of. It's a review from yesterday's Frankfurter Allgemeine newspaper in Germany that I've taken the liberty of translating for those of you who are not German speakers and for Christina as well. Christina Sharpe writes in a different language, a prose that reads like lyrical poetry in a scholarly publication whose arguments challenge us through a precision enriched by the richness of rap, of ballads, of repetition, and refrains. It is not wordplay that Christina Sharpe enacts. It is a speech act directed not only to victims of injustice. To speak of suffering, we need a different language, and for this reason, Christina Sharpe's language sounds different. For writing is an act that brings together history, ideas, feelings, and circumstances. In doing so, it creates a language of what is and what can be. Christina Sharpe's book helps us in this feat by opening a space of thought where no one is without a name. I'm going to turn the podium over to our moderator, Professor Saidiya Hartman, and invite you to join us in occupying the space of language, longing, and justice in the wake. Thank you.
I will briefly introduce Christina, and after her reading, I'll introduce the other panelists. It is my pleasure to welcome Christina Sharpe. She has institutional affiliations at Tufts University. She's the author of Monstrous Intimacies, which was published in 2010, and the book we're celebrating tonight, In the Wake, which was published in November, but it was named by The Guardian as one of the best books of 2016. She is currently working on a critical introduction to the collected poems of Diane Brand and 2 monographs, Thinking Juxtapositionally and Refusing Necrotopia. She has also published essays in The Black Scholar, American Literary History, and The New Inquiry. So just a few words about this amazing text before Christina begins to read. In the Wake is a searing and brilliant manuscript which is far-reaching in its intellectual and aesthetic ambitions. This beautifully written text combines the best elements of the personal essay and the artist's book, yet engages theoretical questions with a facility that is matched by its economy of statement. Analytic rigor is never sacrificed for the beauty of the prose, and the associative movement of the work is an organic enactment of being in the wake. Wake work is the center of Sharp's critical repertoire. The wake is, quote, the conceptual frame of and for living blackness in the diaspora and the still unfolding aftermaths of Atlantic chattel slavery. To be in the wake is Sharp's way of describing the afterlife of slavery and the constitutive and gratuitous violence that makes Black death the norm of our modernity. In the Wake offers a way of thinking about life lived in the wake of anti-Black violence and in an intimate relation with death that moves us beyond the prevailing debate about Afro-pessimism and Black vitalism, social death, and love. The forms of social life and the practices of care that emerge in and that are conditioned by social death are the focus of Sharp's extended meditation on slavery and its afterlife. Wake work, too, is a method. It is a turn away from disciplinary solutions to Blackness's ongoing abjection and toward apprehending the multiple meanings of that abjection through inhabitation, that is, through living them as consciousness, end quote. Wake work is an analytics, an existential ontology, an ethics of engagement, and a poetics of relation that demands that we take care of one another. One of the refrains that structures the text is, quote, we are constituted through and by continued vulnerability to this overwhelming force, yet we are not only known to ourselves and each other by that force. There is beauty and care and creation. Other key terms that structure the work are the door of no return, aspiration, annotation and redaction, anagrammatical Blackness, trans asterisk, orthography, partus secretia ventrum, the intramural, and the afterlife of slavery. Sharp is a deft and creative reader of literary texts and visual images. Her archival rearrangements produce new objects to think with, as well as ways of understanding and apprehending the past. This is in part the result of her gaze. When looking at images of Black suffering, quote, I keep looking because that cannot be all there was to see or to say. I had to take care. Care is the antidote to violence. Her method of archival engagement, annotation, and redaction are ways to imagine otherwise, a mode of transcription, reconstruction, and creation. In her words, quote, they are ways to make Black life visible, if only momentarily. The text moves poetically, associatively, and by thinking through juxtaposition. The series of refrains that structure the text produce a collective utterance rich with the songs and cries of centuries. Sharp deeply inhabits the words and thoughts of Fanon, Kamau Brathwaite, Diane Brand, Bessie Phillips, and others, making obvious the point that we never speak alone, that the chorus is the vehicle for thought, that we are always in relation and need only recognize it. The wake, the ship, the hole, and the weather are the key constellations of the text. Sharp's elaboration of these across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, across North America, the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa, attends to the global dimensions of Black studies, embracing the captive, the migrant, and the refugee. Reading In the Wake, one has the sense that Sharp brings all she knows and loves to the object under consideration, to a ship that is a girl, to eyes that reach out to her and to us, and to the lives lost in the wake. Sharp is a collector and a curator, a poet and a critic, and her strategies of reading, imagining, erasing, and remaking have created a beautiful work that is destined to be one of the classics of Black studies. Please join me in welcoming Christina Sharp.
I was trying to be vain and not wear my glasses, but I think I have to wear my glasses. So I have to narrate the wearing of the glasses too. So I want to begin with thanks. First to Tina Campt and Saidiya Hartman for the invitation and for those incredibly generous introductions, and to Tina for translating the German, which I couldn't read. I'd like to thank the Practicing Refusal Working Group. I'm deeply honored to be in this room and on this panel with so many thinkers whose work has been so important to my own. In fact, it's the ground of my own thinking and work and imagining. Your words, images, organizing, and imagining map the depth and breadth of the anti-Black worlds we inhabit and work to unmake, and the worlds we envision and work to summon into being. And that extends to so many of you in the room who I know, some of you from Twitter, some of you whose work I've read or I've run into, some former students who are here who I'm so pleased to see. It's really a pleasure to be here. And as we know, a group to think and imagine and practice refusal with is never a given. So In the Wake, as you know, has 4 chapters: the wake, the ship, the hold, and the weather. And in them I meant to chart the coordinates of Black life, the terrors we face, and the ways that in and through that terror we survive and more than survive. So I meant to chart the ways that we insist life and resistance and joy and being into the wake. So I'm going to read probably for around 15 minutes from The Ship and The Hold. This is probably the first time I've actually read anything from The Hold. So this is from The Ship. A ship moving through water generates a particular pattern of waves. The bow wave is in front of the ship, and that wave then spreads out in the recognizable V pattern on either side of and then behind the ship. The size of the bow wave dictates how far out the wake starts. Waves that occur in the wake of the ship move at the same speed as the ship. From at least the 16th century onward, a major part of the ocean engineering of ships has been to minimize the bow wave and therefore to minimize the wake. But the effect of trauma is the opposite. It is to make maximal the wake. The transverse waves are those waves that run through the back. They're perpendicular to the direction of the motion of the ship. Transverse waves look straight, but are actually arcs of a circle. And every time, every instant that the boat is moving through water, it has the potential to generate a new wave. Certainly the Zong, far from any land mass, would have been in deep water, and any object or person thrown overboard would have been in deep water waves. Once in the water, that thrown overboard person would have experienced the circular or bobbing motion of the wake, and would have been carried by that wake for at least a short period of time. It's likely, though, that because many of those enslaved people were sick and were likely emaciated or close to it, they would have had very little body fat. Their bodies would have been denser than seawater. It is likely, then, that those Africans thrown overboard would have floated just a short while, and only because of the shapes of their bodies. It is likely, too, that they would have sunk relatively quickly and drowned relatively quickly as well. And then there were the sharks that always traveled in the wake of those slave ships. There have been studies done on whales that have died and sunk to the sea floor. Those studies show that within a few days, the whales' bodies are picked almost clean by benthic organisms, those organisms that live on the sea floor. My colleague Anne Gardulski tells me that it's most likely that a human body would not make it to the sea floor intact. What happened to those bodies? By which I mean, what happened to the components of their bodies in salt water? Anne Gardulski tells me that because nutrients cycle through the ocean, the process of organisms, eating organisms, is the cycling of nutrients through the ocean. The atoms of those people who were thrown overboard are out there in the ocean even today. They were eaten, organisms processed them, and those organisms were in turn eaten and processed, and the cycle continues. Around 90 to 95% of the tissues of things that are eaten in the water column get recycled. As Anne told me, nobody dies of old age in the ocean. The amount of time it takes for a substance to enter the ocean and then leave the ocean is called residence time. Human blood is salty, and sodium, Gardulski tells me, has a residence time of 260 million years. And what happens to the energy that's produced in the waters? It continues cycling like atoms in residence time. We, Black people, exist in the residence time of the wake, a time in which, quote, everything is now. It is all now. The sea was like slate gray of what was left of my body, and the white waves I remember. The first language the keepers of the hold use on the captives is the language of violence, the language of thirst and hunger and sore and heat, the language of the gun and the gun butt, the foot and the fist, the knife and the throwing overboard. And in the hold, mouths open, say thirsty. In July last year, around 100 migrants, these are quotations. In July last year, around 100 migrants were massacred by traffickers after they tried to escape a locked hold as fumes spread from the boat's engine. As the poisonous gas spread below deck, panic started, and the passengers managed to force open the door, only to be met by traffickers armed with knives who started massacring them and throwing them into the sea. Second quotation. A teenage boy from Somalia says he wanted to be called Ali after his friend, who was pushed into the sea alongside other passengers. According to witness accounts gathered by police, the suspected traffickers, 2 Libyans, 2 Algerians, and a Tunisian aged 21 to 24, threatened the migrants on board with knives and beat them with belts to control them. About 100 African migrants, now presumed dead, were allegedly held in the hull of the doomed boat, survivors told police. In the knowledges of people living in the wake, these newspaper narratives have a resonance. We understand the compulsions of capital and our always possible deaths, but these bodies nevertheless try to exceed those compulsions of capital. We inhabit knowledge that the Black body is the sign of imminent, and imminent with an I and an A, death. These are accounts of the hold in the contemporary. In Calais, the keepers of the hold respond with violence as refugees from Europe's continued financialization of their unlivable lives and immiseration attempt to make it into England. Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron refers to them as, quote, a swarm of people coming across the Mediterranean, seeking a better life, wanting to come to Britain because Britain has got jobs, it's got a growing economy, it's an incredible place to live, end quote. Cameron insists on and refuses the hold. In 2005, after uprisings in the wake of the death by electrocution of 2 young men who were being chased by the police, then Interior Minister Nicolas Sarkozy referred to the young people in the streets as scum and riffraff, and he said that he would pressure wash, the Banyuls. Cameron and Sarkozy instrumentalized the orthography of the wake. They instrumentalized the conventions of the brutal language of the hold. Starting tomorrow, they say, we are going to clean the cité with a cachet. In Germany, in Bayreuth, Berlin, and Hamburg, the loggers continue. The Zong repeats and repeats through the logics and calculus of dehumaning started long ago and still operative. The details and the deaths accumulate. The ditto fills the archives of a past that is not yet past. The holds multiply, and so does resistance to them, the survivance of them. Quote, the brittle gnawed life we live. I am held and held. We understand this because we are standing here in eyelashes. I take up again Brand's declaration of doorways, corners, and pursuit, and those lines that follow, I am held and held. And I think, too, of beholding, to see or observe a thing or person, especially a remarkable or impressive one, to hold by, keep, observe, regard, look. And I began this section, which is the hold, with that doorway that is on Brand's retina. What does one behold from that doorway? What has one beheld to declare doorways? Albert Johnson falls, and he has beheld his murderer. Oscar Grant beheld his murderer when he was gunned down by Johannes Mehersel. There's an image that emerged in the wake of Grant's murder on New Year's Day 2011, a photo that was retrieved from his cell phone in the following days. It's a photo of his murderer. It's shot from the angle of the hold. Grant is in the hold. Mehersley is policing it. Grant has apprehended him. The logics of the slave ship and the hold instantiated Obama's reiteration of the terrible calculus of the inability to, quote, save every black life, an awful arithmetic, a violence of abstraction. We are positioned in the knowledge that we're living in the afterlives of slavery, sitting in the room with history, in a lived and undeclared state of emergency. The ground of compromise, the firmament, the access to freedom and democracy littered with black bodies. With the optic of the door of no return on our retina, we might imagine something else, something like what Joy James called a liberated zone, even though under siege. Across time and space, the languages and apparatus of the hold and its violences multiply. So too, the languages of beholding. In what ways might we enact a beholdenness to each other, laterally, beholden, to hold by some tie of duty or obligation, to retain as a client or person in duty bound? This is what Spillers calls the intramural. How are we beholden to and beholders of each other in ways that change across time and place and space and yet remain? Beholden in the wake, as at the very least, if we are lucky, an opportunity back to the door in our black bodies to try to look, to try to see. Thank you.
Just want to give some space around the reading. So I'll introduce the panelists, and I guess everyone will just read in alphabetical order. Is that? So our first respondent is Hazel Carby, who is the Charles and Dorothea Dilley Professor of African American Studies and American Studies at Yale University, as well as the Director of the Initiative on Race, Gender, and Globalization. Her books include Reconstructing Womanhood, Race, Men, and Cultures in Babylon. She is completing a manuscript called Imperial Intimacies, an autohistory of the intimate imperial entanglements of the islands of Britain and Jamaica from the anti-Napoleonic War to the anti-fascist era. Her new work in progress is entitled Treason Workers. Kayama Glover is an associate professor of French and Africana Studies here at Barnard. She specializes in Francophone post-colonial literature with a special focus on the Caribbean. She's the author of Haiti Unbound, a spiralist challenge to the post-colonial canon, a study of canon formation in the French-speaking Caribbean, and her current project, The Audacity of the I, considers narcissism and other ethics of self-care for women in Caribbean prose fiction. She's been the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, and she's also a regular contributor to the New York Times Book Review. These are very abbreviated bios. These are very impressive people. So I'm just... Arthur Jaffa is a director, cinematographer, producer. He was born in Tupelo, Mississippi, as he always likes people to know, but raised in Clarksdale. He is a principal member, along with Malik Hassan Saeed and Alyssa Moorhead, of TNEG, a film company. He has directed numerous films: Slowly This, Smile, Black Millennium, Tree, Yellow Jacket, Deshoten, Dreams Are Colder Than Death, which was selected for the 2014 New York Film Festival, and most recently, the critically acclaimed Love is the Message, Death is the Message. His cinematography includes Daughters of the Dust, 7 Songs from Malcolm X, Crooklyn, A Litany for Survival, and on and on and on and on, okay? Alex Valia is a scholar and teacher of Black literature and culture, critical theory, social technologies, and popular culture. He's a professor in the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern University. He's the author of Phonographies, Grooves, and Sonic Afro-Modernity, which was awarded the Modern Language Association's William Sanders Scarborough Prize for Outstanding Scholarly Study of Black American Literature and Culture, and most recently of Habeas Viscus, Racializing Assemblages, Biopolitics, and Black Feminist Theories of the Human. Currently, he is working on 2 projects. The first, Black Life, Schwartz Sign, establishes Blackness as an ontology of ungendering. The second, Fiending, R&B's Technologies of Humanity, offers a critical history of the intimate relationship between R&B music and technology since the late 1970s. That is our very impressive panel.
So what I'm going to read is not a dispassionate, critical assessment of a book and its author. I do not attempt to summarize or contextualize for those who have not yet read it, but you all should read it. This is actually a personal meditation upon experiencing in the wake, in a climate and state of emergency. 1. Weather. I'm a little under the weather today. Too much pepper spray can make a brother congested. Know what I'm saying? But the harder they hit us, the louder we become, kind of like the skin on a drum. You know what I'm saying? Michael Franti at the WTO protests in 1999. 2, listen. Listen carefully while reading Christina Sharp's In the Wake. For language is being fought over, being wrought, being forged, being worked, to shape and to re-present realities to us. Language here is not wasted upon the mere capture and uncritical reflection of past and present. What is being fought, what is being contested, is our particularly academic captivation by the politics of translating and making legible the suffering black body. We have to cease being captive to the endless cycle of revelation, cease rendering and realizing in comprehensible form the materiality of black suffering, and thus reproducing our narratively condemned status. Instead, Sharp insists, one should accept that violence precedes and exceeds the black, and then move on from this recognition, recognition, to take up the question of what it means to suffer. In the process of clearing a space in which the meaning of suffering can emerge, language is of necessity wrought into unfamiliar, discordant, critical shape. What we thought we meant is, without apology, wrenched away in a meticulous forensic deployment of etymologies until we can clear a space to forge a praxis, a method of articulating a past that is not past. As Christina Sharp states, I am interested in plotting, mapping, and collecting the archives of the everyday of black imminent and imminent death, and in tracking the way we resist, rupture, and disrupt that imminence and imminence, aesthetically and materially. In the Wake creates a critical poetics of alternative sonic registers that force us to hear words differently. 3, look. Because we are listening, We cannot read in a smooth, uninterrupted flow of words that pacifies, that lulls, that reconciles us with and to pastness. In the Wake does not pander to our expectations. It does not soothe or pamper or comfort. Instead, it disrupts expectations, which is exactly the point. We need to recognize the need for a new critical language, and we have to pay attention to exactly where we are and how we got here. We are in the wake of a slave ship. We are tossed and turned and thrown in the wake of a history which is also our present. To stay afloat, we are required to do wake work, to awaken, to be conscious, to participate, to be alert, to stabilize, and to seek a new creative balance. At first, I am lost, unable to see. I am at sea, in the wake, and have to discover, recover the ancient form of acoustic wayfinding, an echolocation to read the contours of where we are in the past present. Gradually, I begin to find my way and perceive a text which is an assemblage, a gathering, a clustering, an amassing of critical meaning. As the meaning of words I think I know fall apart, as I begin to come to terms with Sharp's analysis of anagrammatical blacknesses signifying surplus, I begin to apprehend and share in the work of dissecting, assembling, and reassembling. 4, travel. We are taken. We are taken in by the first sentence. I was not there when my sister died. We are taken up and guided by a distinct and singular first-person voice, a member of a family as it slides from lower middle-class, straitened circumstances into straight-up working poor. A family that lived an awareness of itself as and in the wake of the unfinished project of emancipation. A family that produces a daughter that leaps to Ivy League schools, to tenured professor. But a part of that leap, and apart from its specificities, is an awareness of the precarities of the afterlives of slavery. This I that speaks from a position vulnerable to the will of others, dependent on chance and circumstance, exposed to risk. This I, fully aware of being in the wake, takes ownership over the precarious, over the ongoing disaster of the ruptures of chattel slavery, to cultivate and work, and in full possession, to reap its insights. Conscious of being in this wake gives texture to Sharp's reading practices, to ways of being in and of the world, to relations with and to others. And this is the journey, and the promise. There is no academic cajoling, none of the passive-aggressive tone of intellectual superiority and snobbery that persuades by bullying and humiliation. It is by our own volition that we go where we need to go in the wake, navigating the entanglements of bringing blackness and being into view, across texts and across geopolitical space, and into the deep historical time which haunts, inhabits, and shapes our present. From the barracoon to the hold of a slave ship in the Atlantic, we drown in the Mediterranean only to be held fast in prison cells in Malawi and in the United States of America. We linger, puzzled, over the image of a meager girl in Haiti after the earthquake of 2010, a girl lying on the ground with the word shit in tape on her forehead. Represented as less than human and carriers of terror, and most recently as living in sites of carnage, we are held in the aftermath of death, in the classroom, in the hospital, in the streets, waiting for the violation of exorable accounting from our prosecutors, from our murderers. In the Wake is performative. I keep thinking about its sonic pitch, about the rhythm of its sentences, of the clash of words with pain. It is also collective. The text has a cast of characters, a strong presence of Black feminist theorists, a Greek chorus of sorts, not limited to commenting on, but engaging, enlarging, and participating in the creation of the text. Dion Brand, Saidiya Hartman, Catherine McKittrick, Nobesa Phillips, Hortense Spillers, and Sylvia Winter are fully present in their own singular voices and words. Words which are not so much incorporated into In the Wake, but make interventions in their own right. Christina Sharp, simultaneously author and protagonist, creates complex conversations between and among them all, as if the book were collectively authored and recited. In Our Wake struggles over and with historical memory. Christina Sharp questions how historical memory is constituted, and she interrogates acts of remembrance and memorialization. Ship time is the counter to monumental time. Sharp writes and rewrites and refigures in the search for a critical form and a creative use of language measured to her labor. The multiplicity and variety of associations across and connections between texts, epistemologies, ontologies, and geopolitical spaces in the Wake become a form of historical time travel. And I think of Jamila Woods singing, "Look at what they did to my sisters last century, last week." Thank you.
There are many ways into Christina's insightful and thought-provoking book. But of course, I can't possibly cover the breadth and depth of that provocation here, so I'm going to follow one particular way in. I'm going to say a few words about what in her project spoke to me most loudly, resounded most clearly with my own work and thought. And my reflections are going to turn around a constellation or a collage of word concepts, 6 to be exact: migrant, refugee, archive, ship, resilience, and outrage. As a Haitianist scholar, these have long been the conceptual foundations of my own work, and so when I was asked to find a way to think with and through Christina's book in this forum, these are the word concepts that were my conduits, my ways into the project: migrant, refugee, archive, ship, resilience, and outrage. And of these 6 word concepts, the most troublesome, and in this way perhaps the most important to me right now, is resilience, from the Latin resilere, leaping back. Resilience means quick recovery from injury or difficulty. It means adaptability to stress or trauma. And it means the capacity to resume an original form or condition, elasticity. And it is, as we all know, a term that is gleefully applied to migrants and to refugees, a category that has long been applicable to Haitians. They are, if nothing else, resilient. And so I've thought quite a lot about the value of migrants and refugees, the utility of their resilience, for some time now. The migrant, the refugee, is an embodiment of the tension between movement and immobility that is so often and so profoundly the experience of Black people. Always in motion, never arriving at a new state, a new condition, resilient, returning to same. I mean to signal embodiment in particular in its most material sense, because this is very much something that In the Wake calls on us to do. Christina insists that we behave warily when it comes to migrant Blackness, when it comes to theorizing migrant Blackness. She insists that we attend to the materiality of the refugee, to the individual lives called upon, not in fact to ameliorate their situation, but really to resume their original condition, to be resilient. At the same time, of course, that we secretly resent or disdain a resilience that is essentially a stubborn refusal to go away, a stubborn not dying. She insists on this attentiveness to the material, I think, because such materiality can too easily slip out of our scholarly discourse. Caribbean discourse, for example, tends to give us the ship first as a metaphor of possibility and potentiality. From James to Walcott to Glissant to Dash to Césaire, they've all come up giving us ships as spaces of, quote, contained openness, wherein, quote, renegade subjectivities issue a challenge to hegemonic nationalisms or neoliberal globalism. And yes, okay, I get how these are potentially liberating narrative constructs. I see, of course, the counter-discursive value of notions of migration as, quote, escape from the prison house of imperial narrative, or psychic, I'm not meaning to make fun, but, but I'm just saying, all right? So, I realize, I guess I am. Well, you know, here we are. I continue, a piece. Escape from the prison, I'm owning it, of imperial narrative or, quote, psychic marinage. But you can see, right, how in the face of a girl with the word ship taped to her forehead, that these theorizations just might not do the trick. And so, as just a couple of responses, or actually a response to a particular question that Christina poses, it's on, for those of you who have your books, it's on page 118, so I'm going to cheat and use the beauty of her words to enhance my own commentary. But I'll read quickly the question that I want to answer. She writes, and this is about the girl in the photograph that I think we're also taken with and by. She is looking straight ahead of her or directly at or past the photographer's camera. She looks to be in shock. Her big black eyes with their lush eyelashes look glazed. Her look reaches out to me. Affixed to her forehead is that piece of transparent tape with the word ship written on it. What is the look in her eyes? What do I do with it? The first annotation was that word ship. What can one see beyond that word that threatens to block out everything else. So I'm going to propose an answer to Christina's question. What do we see in her eyes? What can we see beyond that wordship? Resilience, perhaps, or perhaps defiance. Defiance at the idea of her expected resilience. Defiance at the idea of her expected elastic return to her original condition. Or perhaps even outrage. Outrage at the conditions of her participation in the archive and its carceral logics, its violence. Because I realize that among much else, Christina has given us within the Wake an outraged archive. And you can find that archive in her notes, from her mother's letters to the Philadelphia Inquirer, to Dasani Coates' perpetual refusal of her original condition. Christina's notes contain a world of Wake work. And I got caught up in the eddies of your notes. After I finished the book, I systematically went through them online, tracing these newspaper articles and being in this space with her. And in my head, as I went through the archive that is the World Wide Web and its characterization of Black being, I thought to myself about this beautiful sentence that she has on page 18, if you brought your books. We must become undisciplined. We must become undisciplined, outraged, and immoderate in our work. And In the Wake is exemplary of this very necessary praxis. That's all.
I'm going to play a little something first before I read. I was really, I was a little traumatized by the book, I think. Speaking of trauma, so let me see if I can make this work properly. Deep inside we knew our love was true for a while. We paid no mind to the past. We knew love would last every night. Something right would invite us to begin the day. Something along the way we used to be the same. Quote, no one was with my sister when she died at home. The autopsy report was inconclusive, cosmetic aftermath of death of her son. In the wake, at the wake, are we wake? As a verb, emerge or cause to emerge from a state of sleep, stop sleeping. As a noun, a watch or vigil held beside the body of someone who's died, sometimes accompanied by ritual observances, famously explored in Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, but also in Amar's The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. Whose wake are we attending? Prince died in his elevator at Paisley Park. Don't ever let the elevator bring us down. And most people don't know this, but Michael Jackson died crying for his daddy. What are the parameters of these aftermath thematics, Drexel readings? Drexel was an underwater country populated by the unborn children of pregnant African women who were thrown off slave ships. The babies had adapted to breathe underwater in their mother's wombs. Ebo, Calabar, fly us home, holding the head of the dead, sufferheads all. We be butchers as surgeons, all hands on deck, speakers for the dead. What are these epidermal discrepancies? Am I not human? I am not human, what am I? These felt gaps, absences between that which is known and that which is actively unknown, these nodal exigencies, oppressing, urgent situation that hurt so bad, we sing so sad. What are our narcotized affect, our half-lives, our playing it cool way too well, pretending dead way too well? Black Lives Matter, wake, woke, adrift, death and absence, dub structures. Like many of these black people on the move, my parents discovered that things were not better in this new world. How little difference between the upward and downward mobility, the narrow register of black lives in this space. Upon being told of her eldest sister, Ida Mae, was dead, he said he was coming to get me. He told me I shouldn't be alone. I put down the phone and fell asleep. No escape for us. We survived the depths of still unfolding aftermath. What is the nature of this perpetual post-trauma that so defines black being, regardless of our relative situationality in the social hierarchy, the non-linearity of it, the caustic unpredictability of it? Still in the middle passage with this chained existentiality, group coffins, we are bound to one another, knowing, as per Cornell, what one cannot not know as a black person in America. Since everyone dies when we are human, what is this overdetermined relationship to death? What to make of this trauma, this gestalt? Wake. The track felt on the water surfaced by a ship, the disturbance caused by a body swimming or moved in water, the air currents behind a body in flight, a region of disturbed flow. The hold, death grips, emergence, diurnal, forged subjects, zombie we, dharma. What the book maps out in exquisite, intimate detail is the paradoxical nature of our insight, our superpower really, our supernal relationship to this half-life, this situated betweenness of being so-called blackness that increasingly defines not just us, but the parameters of global citizenship. I can say that word. The Boisian double consciousness, our characteristic state of being, rests on the gap between black and white, the living and the dead, the pre and the aftermath, the relative vantage, this troubled consciousness, this black consciousness. Oh, but I weary of black death, they say. So why these infernal interrogations of black death and this receding mirror stage black consciousness? I suggest because we are struggling to name, to know this next emancipatory phase, stage in our collective being. It's not slavery, it's not Jim Crow. From black power to black consciousness to black ...
Split into 4 chapters, The Wake, The Ship, The Hold, and The Weather in the Wake on Blackness and Being fruitfully extends the historical, literary, and conceptual concerns of Sharp's first book, Monstrous Intimacy, because it so trenchantly brings to the fore the different facets of what Saidiya Hartman has referred to as the afterlife of slavery. That is, the many ways that black subjects are still excluded from the domain of liberal personhood and humanity, and perversely serve as the bearers of global terror, or serve as the bearers of terror globally, whether in the US, Haiti, Israel, or the depths of the Mediterranean Sea. In this way, Sharp's work is in dialogue with Black studies scholars such as Catherine McKittrick, Denise De Silva, Saidiya Hartman, Fred Moten, Simone Brown, and Niamh Chandler. But Sharp also deftly engages Afro-pessimism in the work of Wilderson and Sexton. And in that last regard, Sharp's scholarship adds an emphasis on the quotidian modes of black resistance and much-needed considerations of gender and sexualities to the debates around Afro-pessimism and black being. Professor Sharp riffs off of and remixes the different significations of the wake. And you should read the book in order to know what these significations are. So in any case, and to emerge from a state of slumber in the service of delineating the vicissitudes of black being, which though adjacent to an intimate relation with different forms of death can never be reduced to it. Focusing primarily on the contemporary world, Sharp brilliantly analyzes a wide range of It has been a really long day, a wide range, but of course we also heard about the outrage, so maybe it's a rage of texts and not only a range of texts. Filmic, I will spare you the listing of all of these. Literary, we've heard about many of them already today. So Sharp juxtaposes and fuses these considerations with contemporary news accounts and images, such as the image of the Haitian girl, the killings of a young Eritrean child in Israel, the police murders of Ayanna Stanley Jones and Mike Brown in the US, and a journalistic account of Temple University Hospital's Cradle to the Grave program in Philadelphia. Overall, Christina Sharp is at her most trenchant when she excavates and amplifies the forgotten, yet nevertheless central black female figures at the margins. The figure, besides the girl named Ship, quote unquote, that I'm haunted by, is the former mother, Ariel Jackson. How do you become a former mother? In Sekula and Birch's film. Though these black female figures are at the center of the visual field through which they are represented, neither merits narrative enfleshment, right? Whether this is in the mainstream media or in experimental film. They cannot be seen in the current order of things because the former mother signifies yet another homeless and drug-addicted black woman, and the young girl in the New York photograph simply stands in for the devastation wrought on the Haitian people in the aftermath of a 2010 earthquake. Sharp's wake work manages this feat by offering stories that linger in the wake of the ship and the shipping container, unearthing black life where none is presumed. In the words of Catherine McKittrick, Sharp amplifies, and I'm quoting from McKittrick here, the possibilities that are iterations of black life that cannot be contained by black death, end quote. This is, however, no simple rescue mission that gives voice to those silenced, but something different. Because as a book in the way conjures an active and imaginative outraged archive of the wake work necessary to bear witness to the ongoing violent dispossession of black being in the modern Western schema of things, which is evident throughout the book, but especially trenchant in the opening autobiographical section that a few of my colleagues have already brought up. Sharp is nothing if not a scholar of the literary, attuned to minuscule movements of words and sentences on the page, as well as their, at times, seismic effects on the surrounding atmosphere. If prose fiction stood at the center of Monstrous Intimacies, Professor Sharp's first book, then poetry, or rather an expanded field of poetics, especially the oeuvres of Dion Brand, Nurbese Philip, and Kamau Brathwaite, serve as both primary texts of analysis and models for the style of writing Sharp adopts throughout In the Wake. This makes In the Wake a formally daring scholarly work, as has been pointed out, which on the one hand, in its use of autobiography, brought to mind Lose Your Mother by Professor Hartman, but on the other hand, also conjures for me something akin to Walter Benjamin's Arcades project, right? And I would want to think in terms of the outraged archive in relationship to the Arcades project. I also think the way that the text uses photographs and typography, both in the quoted text and in other forms, also is in dialogue with Benjamin. Sharp marshals these innovative formal strategies in the service of both loitering, and I use that word advisedly because of the legal connotations of it, in the hold of the ship, and in order to imagine otherwise. And now I have a few questions that Professor Sharp need not answer, as I told her, but that I think the best scholarly or critical and even imaginative work raises as many questions as it addresses. So a few of my questions. After I finished reading the text, I yearned to read more about Sharp's take on the usage of trans asterisks and its relationship to blackness. And she writes, for instance, that she uses trans asterisks. I'm just going to say trans from now on, always imagine the asterisk there, please, in a variety of ways, and I'm quoting from Professor Sharp, that try to get at something about or toward the range of transformations enacted on Black bodies, rather than recover transgender bodies in the archive. If, as Sharp, end quote, holds, the Black and queer Atlantic have always been the transatlantic, how do these fields enact transness differently? Are using trans in this way and recovering transgender bodies in the archives mutually exclusive, right? And what might it look like to use trans in this way and recover transgender bodies in the most broad definition? To continue on that path, is the white Atlantic always already trans as well? I also wondered how Sharp's arguments about the incessant violence and killing of Black bodies in the contemporary world might shift if they were not presented primarily, and here this is a question of the archive, through the lens of mainstream journalistic venues such as the New York Times. And I'm just going to rephrase this here because I don't like the formulation. The last question is sort of related to this, and it's about the, this idea of the dysgraphia of disaster. And to think about, I mean, when I initially read it, and I'm just going to be a little blunt here, I know this as a real, quote unquote, impairment, right? And so for me, instead of saying, you know, well, this shouldn't be in this context, what I would be interested to think about is what does it mean to use dysgraphia in this particular kind of context, right? What does this teach us about thinking about the relationship between Black life and death, and both impairment and disability, right? Because I think that it has some kind of impact on both of these. So, you know, to put it somewhat more crudely, how is this dysgraphia, right, that is described in the text, how is this different from simple false consciousness, right, which can be violent and deadly? But I think that there is something in terms of, I think that there's something there in terms of thinking about the physicality, so to speak, about dysgraphia, right? And that's really what I'm sort of urging, I guess, all of us to collectively think about. I had a few more questions, but I'll just stop now because it's late and all that stuff. So thank you. And thank you to Christina Sharp for making this possible.
So I don't know if you wanted to address any of the things that were said, and then I was thinking we just open it up to the...
Well, first, I want to thank each of you for these really, I mean, what a sort of rare treat and pleasure to sit at a table with people whose work I deeply respect and read and teach and quote to speak with me, to speak with us about the work. So thank you all. I want to joke and say, Alex, you told me I didn't have to answer any of your questions, so I'm not going to.
But you don't have to, though.
but that is kind of a joke. I love the idea of, well, now I took all these notes in some strange pattern that I won't be able to read, but you know, I love your. Oh, can you? Oh, sorry. The sort of parsing of resilience. I think that was so. I hate the way in which Black people are always described as resilient across location, across geopolitical location. And so I loved your parsing of it, and that maybe what we see is disdain and outrage at having to be expected to be resilient. Hazel, you said something which okay, let me put the glasses back on. You know, I loved the way you were sort of thinking with me about sound and etymology, and you said forensics, but you said something about the sort of cast of characters. The Greek chorus. You were saying the Greek chorus of sorts participating in the creation of the text. And I thought that was, I mean, I've learned so much from listening to you all. And I thought that was really, I don't know, fruitful, productive. It gives me another way to think about about the text. Because I know that I was sort of collecting, and I don't, and of course I wrote the book, but I also feel like it was something, if I sit back and think about it, I'm not quite sure how. Then AJ, you're playing After the Love Is Gone, and sort of thinking about it in relation to your own work, right, which has been really important to my own as well. And I want to hear more about you being traumatized by the text. And also then thinking about the sort of form and the ... Alex, I was thinking about dysgraphia, and so when you ask about what did you ask me? About false consciousness. And I'm wondering, are you speaking about sort of black, in terms of a black subject? Because I'm thinking about dysgraphia, and I was aware that dysgraphia is also a kind of diagnosis, but I was thinking about the sort of diagnosis by the sort of white writing of black life, the white inability to write black life. And so that's the only way in which I was really thinking about dysgraphia. So maybe it's a kind of loose, given my etymological forensics, maybe it sort of fell off in that moment. But I'm really only thinking about it in that one register. And then I think the question about, and I'm not going to do justice to the questions, but they're great for me to sort of keep thinking with. The question about the transasterisk and how do they enact transness differently, and sort of broad definition. I guess I wasn't excluding the idea of since I am sort of thinking with Spillers and questions of ungendering and differently gendering, I'm not excluding the finding of trans bodies. I simply wasn't trying to do a certain kind of recovery work, right? So I don't know if that answers your questions, but I think they're really wonderful to think with, and I don't know. Does anybody else want to speak to any of them? I mean, I'm still sort of thinking through all of the sort of rich readings that you've given me.
I think both Hazel and I brought up this whole issue of the chorus and the notion of the assemblage of the text and its status as a kind of collective utterance. And I don't know if you want to say more about that, both in terms of, an imagination of politics that seems, I would say that's distinctly feminist, because we know that there's, a great amount of work on something like the Black tragic or the Black radical tragic, and there's always a heroic Enlightenment figure, gendered male, who embodies that articulation. So I don't know if you just want to say more about, were you thinking about producing this collective articulation? Were you thinking the form of that feminist politics and how that relates to a radically different imagining of sociality?
I mean, those are great. I don't know if I was consciously thinking it, right? I mean, it sort of evolved in particular ways. So the book really began, as I've said, some of you who've heard me talk about the book before, the book really began with it began with a kind of collection over time. And I found that I was collecting these sort of images and narratives that focused on girls and Black girls and women. And originally I was going to have a chapter called The Girl. But the book really began, I think, in earnest with when I found the image of the little girl in the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti with the word ship on her head. And I think that I wasn't interested in writing a kind of, I think Monstrous Intimacies is a sort of more, it's a more conventional sort of academic monograph. And I think that I was really interested in trying to, the way in which I'm interested in keeping in conversation all of the definitions of most words, is the same way I wanted to keep in conversation all of these different poets, theorists, writers who I didn't so much want to read critically as think with and keep thinking through their work. So in that sense, I was interested in the ways in which our understandings are collective, and so how to perform that kind of collectivity and how to perform it primarily through thinking with Black women writers and Black, lesbian, and queer writers. And I was interested in a kind of, and it is a kind of a politics of thinking collectively and trying to not speak for, but speak with each other.
I'm just, it's not fully ahead on how I was traumatized by it, but a little bit. I mean, one of the things that I think struck me the most about it, and it's something that I think I've been struggling with myself in my work, is the issue of how to address big issues like, theoretical, Olympian theoretical notions, and at the same time how to layer oneself into it. I think there's a tendency that if you put your own experiences in it, it kind of, short circuits something. And so I thought the thing that was most striking me, struck me about it, and even why I chose the music is because I just constantly found myself being in the space that you were speaking from. I'd start even from the beginning. It was such a, I don't even want to call it confessional, but it was just so straightforward in terms of talking about the own arc of your circumstances. I felt very much that a lot of your insights were very much grounded in not being in a certain place, but the movement from one place to another. So I think Hazel, that's an incredible line in there when you talk about going from being middle class to being working poor. It's just, oftentimes you see people will do biographical things that sort of address that. But you very seldom, I can't think of a whole bunch of examples where people are trying to do both things at the same time. So I thought that was really amazing and made me think a lot about how do I, in my own work, how do you negotiate that, how you do. I know Sadia did it a bit, and obviously. But it's not super common though, is what I'm trying to say.
And I wasn't sure that, I wasn't sure how I felt about having it in there, but then I actually felt that it was really necessary. Because I remember sort of thinking, how am I going to write? I ended up not writing an introduction, right? And I thought that was going to be the introduction, and then it became the first chapter. But I kept thinking about, how did I want to begin this? And I thought it was an ethical choice that I was collecting and have been collecting over time all of these stories about Black people who are suffering, murdered, etc. And I thought, how can I, at the same time that I'm writing this, and these things are happening in my own family and have been happening in my family, how can I not include that? And Saidiya's book was really a model for me in sort of thinking that through as not, as you say, sort of navel-gazing, but as an instance of, as an instance of how these things are impacting one, for me, how an instance of these things are impacting one particular family in what I talk about as the wake of slavery. So I didn't want to be confessional. I simply wanted to position myself in and of the same circumstances in which we find ourselves. And I didn't, and I thought it was important. So I thought it was an ethical choice, that whatever discomfort I felt around it, and I do feel some discomfort about it, not around the disclosure, but the reality of being undisciplined. But I thought that it was important and necessary and the ethical choice to make. Because how can I talk about the Sani Coates? How can I read the little girl who I know nothing about other than what I'm seeing and trying to read because of the ways in which, they say that the sort of images of blackness are always supposed to hit in a register of abandonment, right? And I felt that it was important to position myself.
I was wondering how you read something like the astounding parapraxis that our president made regarding Frederick Douglass, and both the quotidianness of it, but also that the sense that having a president who seems to not know who Frederick Douglass is also allows us to have a president who doesn't know that Frederick Douglass is dead. And like I guess I was also thinking about how
Right, didn't somebody start the hashtag, the real Frederick Douglass?
right, but now
Which Twitter will not shut down the, what does my friend call it, the Orange Menace, or, but will shut down the real Frederick Douglass, okay.
but I guess I was just wondering, you know, how that sort of his own, what seems to be his own profound anxiety, talking about anything other than himself, really, but how his slips and the slips that are surfacing in the discourse, like, evidence the kind of history being in the present or present being in history, and if, you know, that those like quotidian slips, whether there's a kind of availability there.
Can this be directed to all of us?
And do you want to collect, maybe collect another question too? Do you want to collect a second question?
Okay, sure. Saidiya has asked us to start bundling a few questions that might be useful.
I think the round table today, and also I think the book emphasizes explicitly theorizing the wake of wake work, and I'm wondering about the work of wake work, and I was just hoping to hear people talk about what that is. What is it referring to? Is it critical practice? Is it naming a form of life that is always working? Is it a practice of reading, artistic production? So what is the book's relationship to work and labor?
This is, I think, a question for all of you. Could you speak to how what Christina just spoke to about pushing the limits of academic writing, which I think all of you have done in really important and critical ways, and how you kind of push against the limits for your own selves. And I mean, I want to say this particular moment, but as we're seeing many, many moments.
I also think that you need to introduce yourself for a moment.
Hi, I'm Abby Schreiber.
Abby Schreiber is the genius
Hi,
person
Abby.
who's done a lot of work in making this book happen as a research assistant, both for Christina and for me. So,
Abby got all
bless
of
you.
the permissions for all of the images and the text in my head. And I've never met Abby before, so I'm not sure where to start. So maybe I'll start with the first question. And it was really hard to hear all of it. I don't know what it opens up. Maybe what it opens up is like the same thing with the statement about John Lewis opens up. It opens up the possibility that a lot more people will know that who Frederick Douglass is. The other kinds of things it opens up are a revelation of sort of deep ignorance, as if we needed more revelation of deep ignorance. I think the question about wake work, I think it's all of those things, sort of reading practice, critical practice, a practice of care, a practice of thinking and attempting to see and look. As I said, and at the very end of the first chapter, that I hope, and maybe I'll just read it again because I won't get it right, but that it was my hope that the praxis of the wake and wake work might have enough capaciousness to travel and do work that I have not been able to imagine or anticipate. And so I try to think through a variety of ways that I was trying to make sense of it, and I hope that if it's a concept that is useful, that the way that it does have the capacity to travel in terms of art practice, in terms of ways of looking and ways of forming kind of modes of care outside of the state, whatever that might be, right? Whether it's community response work as a kind of wake work. Right? If we're always being pushed and in various places toward deathliness, then how can we respond to each other? I'm sorry that that's probably not such a capacious answer, but maybe as I listen to other people, I will keep thinking about it. And then what was the third question? Abby, what was your question? Everybody's question.
Pushing the limits of academic
Innovation.
So I
All
think,
of you can respond to
Yes.
that question. Yes, you can.
I actually just wanted to say something about your question about what it is, what it does as a practice. Because when I was first preparing remarks, I kind of at first wanted to simply talk about Christina's fearlessness in writing this book, and to what extent that fearlessness might, I mean, I guess this sort of answers your question as well, Abby, but that fearlessness might be contagious as a praxis of scholarship. And I'm so glad that you said and explained what you did about the ethics of including yourself in the project as what that was. I mean, one could sense that it wasn't anything of the horrible things it could be, right? But that it was so deeply considered as the practice you were trying to embody. And so in that sense, you know, there are some other echoes in Wake that, like, we didn't fall into the easy, like, it's being woke, like woke work, right? I mean, that's fine. But that is partially what we mean. And woke in the sense of being vigilant, insofar as being in a wake is sitting in vigil, right? Being conscious and attentive, and, you know, I use the term wary, but kind of fierce and fearless in doing one's work and thinking about not just the content of what's being said, but how you say it, and of course how you teach it, right?
and I think the recognition that there's always something at stake. And, you know, I think that the sort of, thank you. And I think the image of the little girl is one instance. I sat with that image for 3.5 years before I could write about it. And because I did want to try to take care with her. And I tried to find out information about her. I couldn't reach the photographer. Getty sent him a message. He didn't understand my message, etc. But I think it is both about sort of time. So there's something about time, that both the sort of elongated time, but also urgency, and something about ethics, and something about refusing. Well, I keep thinking of the title of Joy's and João Costa Vargas's article. Now it's what refusing.
Black cyborgs?
Yes, the refusing victimization, Trayvon Martin and Joy, and Black Cyborg. Thank you.
Hello, Professor Sharp. This question's for you.
Brianna was a student of mine, but she graduated a couple years ago.
Professor Sharp's the reason I graduated. She literally saved my life. My question is about care and taking care. When you wrote this book, taking care of yourself, this book was a big difference, or there was a big difference between this and Monstrous Intimacies. Mm-hmm. And I could kind of feel it in the words that you used and in the spaces where you didn't use words. So I'm wondering, as you're thinking about taking care of the subject matters in a space where there was a lot of violence, how did you also take care of yourself as you wrote through this violence?
Mm-hmm. Do you know, Brianna, that's the question my students always ask me.
And that's care about you. Gosh.
I know, that's so lovely. That's really lovely, actually. Thank you. It's a question I only get from my students, really. And that is beautiful. Thank you.
We don't not care.
No, I know. But it's always the students who ask the question first. That's great. It was a hard book to write. I don't know that I have. First of all, I apologize for the inadequacy of some of my answers. I'm still on Dayquil and suppressing a cold. You know, I didn't write it alone. I wrote it with. I talked to people. I shared the work with people. I had, whole kinds of conversations, both with texts and with people in the flesh who I couldn't have written it without. So I couldn't have written it without the sort of chorus, but also the sort of actual group of people who I talked to as I was writing it. I mean, so like I sat down for 12, 14 hours a day and wrote. And I sort of met people for dinner and had conversations and, had to go through, sort of after my brother's death, didn't write for like 4 or 5 months. And then realized, like I felt a deep urgency about trying to finish the book and trying to speak some things sort of into the world that I felt needed to be spoken, and trying to not allow for those kinds of divides that said that you couldn't talk about you couldn't talk about the Caribbean and the continent and the United States and Canada all in the same space. So I think it was really having both people on the page and people in the world that helped me think through and complete the work.
So my question is about the weather, because when I was reading that section, it made me think of the Anthropocene, and I wanted to push out both beyond the moment of the slave trade, both into the past and into the future, which is our imminent demise, unfortunately, right? Because we persist in polluting and destroying. And so, and in part, as a response to the way that you're playing with language, it made me think of the weather, like WH, like this sort of refusal to sort of face this atmosphere. So I just wanted you to maybe push out a little bit, if you have the energy and feel like it, to think a little bit more about the weather, sort of writ large.
I'm not sure that I fully understand the question. So can you say a little bit more, to think more about the weather writ large in terms of our sort of imminent demise?
Right. So there's the concept of the Anthropocene, which is that we are living in man-made weather, essentially, right? And that this man-made weather is, and our refusal to sort of come to grips with the way that we are. Destroying the planet is actually, sort of pushing us. And so that sense of weather, your sense of weather sort of bled into that sense of weather. So that's what I would...
Absolutely. Okay. And I would say that part of the sense of the weather in terms of plantation management is also that sort of man-made weather, right? It is the shaping of, it is that sort of pushing into, but really attached to certain bodies at least, that sort of pushing into a kind of oblivion, and the kind of oblivion that I think you so beautifully spoke about, the sort of the look of the little girl sort of resisting, that kind of pushing, the outrage or of the response to the fact that you're still here. I guess I want to ask if do you want to respond some?
But I was thinking, did you know, Anna Singh's book, The Mushroom, because it's kind of thinking
You've
that
mentioned that
constellation
before.
of the plantation, the Anthropocene, and where these kind of economies of scale begin. So that might be more direct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard you mention it before, and I downloaded it, and I still haven't read it.
I'm interested in, not interested, I guess I'm invested in working through in the wake and wake work, the ways in which you conceptualize a trans politic, and for me, I conceptualize Blackness as inherently trans, as always a body in movement, a body in motion, a body that's always in transition and becoming. So I'm interested in how you find beautiful Black trans feminist aesthetics and politics in wake work, and what that means for you.
That's a great question, but I also want to say, so what do you think? I want to hear. And so you phrased the question so beautifully. I want to hear you thinking with it. And that's not a cop out. I mean, I really do want to hear.
No, I know it's not a cop out. Ooh, girl. Because I'm processing this like idea of oceanic feeling. Or Alex, do you have some?
I think Alex can
Yeah,
answer
yeah.
this question.
I'm
because
interested in that.
Yes, it speaks to-
He gave a great talk,
In
one
wake
sign
work,
that was dealing
in forms
with
of
these
care,
issues.
in
Yeah.
forms of holding bodies, and memories, and archives, bodies that can be written to the archive, right? Like Blackness.
Alex? I know it's been a long day, but go ahead.
It's a big question of heart.
No, I mean, I guess.
I also can email you.
Yes.
I guess I wouldn't necessarily use the term transness in that particular context, even though I hear what you're saying, and I also heard what Christina wrote in the in the book. I guess for me, the two terms that sort of do that work are ungendering, and the other term that I've been working with is Toni Cade Bambara's idea of blackhood, and to think about blackness as not only a racial category, but also a gender and a sexuality. So that's.
Yeah.
I mean, I was at Alex's, talk earlier, and I think we say these things, as theoretical positions, and then we live them in the world. And anecdotally, I was in Miami, a few weeks ago, and I was standing in the lobby of a hotel, and I was being perceived as a threat, and the concierge kept on eyeing me. And then at one point, he came over to me and he said, "Sir, is there a problem?" And then he said, "Excuse me, miss." And in one sense, that's so much about this relationship between blackness and trans. I mean, I was in that racialized category of threat, and it had a gender attached to it. And so that's the other. Yeah.
And the fact that he switched to miss. I mean.
Then but it was like, oh wait, he had to look at me and then kind of make an adjustment. But his first form of address, and a week before, I had been with like a friend who's a trans man, and we had both, but who is white, and we had both been addressed as ladies in the context, of this restaurant. So I think that the way in which, blackness and ungendering and the kind of instability about our forms of life in these gendered categories are constantly articulated in everyday life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fierce. I live for you.
Yeah.
I read your work every day.
Hey, can I ask a question? Can I ask a question just about that? Because I'm curious about that. What would you, do you have any ideas about what to attribute that to? Like is this, for lack of a better term, gender flux or whatever? Is that bound up with us not being classically human or something?
I guess I was thinking about the poetry of your work, which everyone's been talking about as poetry, and there are so many features of it that we tend to refer to as poetic, whether it's the unmaking and remaking of words, the place of repetition, and also that kind of undisciplined quality, the challenge to discipline. And I was thinking of how central poetry has always been to Black feminist practice, but I also feel like we're in a moment where poetry is enjoying this kind of new power or new prominence in our collective conversation. And I'm wondering why you think that is, if you're feeling it, and how, if it's connected to the also sense of crisis and urgency. Poetry.
Yeah, good question. I do think, and I know that a number of people think about poetry as offering something outside of narrative, so outside the kind of narrative constraints, outside the kind of outside a kind of narrative violence that poetry. So what is it? It's something. So Dionne Brand says that the reader interrogates narrative, poetry interrogates the reader. So something about the way in which you're positioned in relation to poetry. I don't think that I'm a poet. I think that I was really attuned to the way that the language sounds. But I do think that there's something that poetry speaks to across time, but also acutely in this moment. Some sort of possibility of imagining something outside a kind of narrative violence that is a way of sort of breaking the hold that the word has on us.
So I think that's a wonderful place to wrap up. I'm going to ask you to, I want ask you to thank all of our panelists. Thank you for being a great audience.